So next up, we have Professor Keith Snedegar, and he's joining us from the US. Thanks for getting up, Keith. Keith is a professor of history at the Utah Valley University. He has degrees from Edinburgh and Oxford, and he did a postdoc here at UCT studying South African indigenous astronomical systems. But today, Keith will be talking to us about the shape of astronomy in South Africa between 1907 and 1937. Thanks, Keith.
Thank you very much. And first of all, I have to thank everyone involved in managing, producing this virtual conference. It, in a way, is a technical achievement, but more than that, it's a human achievement. And it's been a very productive symposium so far, and I hope that in a small way, my brief contribution can add to that. My comments this afternoon are focused on astronomy in South Africa from 1907 to 1937, after GILL, which means Sir David GILL, who was really the last lion of the heroic period in the history of astronomy in Southern Africa. When GILL arrived at the Cape in 1879, there was still a vast frontier as far as Europeans were concerned in the subcontinent, and much was unknown. And he was the director of a small colonial scientific facility. By the time he got on a Union Castle steamer to leave the Cape in 1906, he was directing an internationally recognized research center, arguably the most important observatory in the Southern Hemisphere, a facility that was fairly well funded through the British Admiralty, although GILL had his complaints with the UK government and with the Royal Navy. And he was always topping up funding and finding other resources elsewhere. But I think most importantly, it was an institution that had a fairly large human establishment. The expertise at the Cape was unrivaled in the Southern Hemisphere and noteworthy in global astronomy by the beginning of the 20th century. And if nothing else, GILL established the central research program for the Cape Observatory that would continue for decades after his retirement. It was fundamental positional astronomy, more or less, cataloging tens of thousands of stars, measuring their proper motion and parallax for the nearby stars. Somewhat later, the magnitude and color, the spectral class of stars. And this was a monumental job before the age of information technology and big data, a job that would take more or less the next half century at the Cape. And in a human way, GILL's network internationally and in South Africa was very significant. He was a mentor to so many researchers and a collaborator with many others. Those would be active well into the 20th century, beyond his directorship at the Cape and indeed his life, which ended in 1914. But I want to focus on the period after GILL, the period in which his legacy is being confronted. Particularly at the Cape, the situation changes, perhaps scientifically, but certainly politically within a few years with the formation of the Union of South Africa in 1910. All of a sudden, the status of the observatory shifted from one that was colonial and largely South African to one that is clearly imperial and definitely British. Those who've commented on the history of the Cape Observatory in this period like to mention the relationship, the very cordial relationship with local amateur astronomers and the South African appointments that were made to the observatory by GILL's successors, S.S. Howe and Harold Spencer Jones. But in fact, local amateurs were kept at a friendly distance from what was happening at the Cape. In those local appointments, the South African astronomers had no opportunity to pursue personal research. They were given their research, which is usually very tedious and career consuming to pursue. And career, career development, well, it was severely limited for these local astronomers. There's no question that His Majesty's astronomer himself would be a Cambridge Wrangler, and even the chief assistant would come from a British background, and that the ties that bound the observatory and its research were British through the Greenwich Royal Observatory and the Royal Astronomical Society. So as a South African institution, the Cape Observatory was, somewhat limited in its impact. If I had to mention one person who has a South African vision for the future of astronomy, it'd have to be Robert Innes, the Union astronomer from 1912 to 1927. Like GILL, Innes was a Scotsman who had a wide-ranging imperial career. He spent many years in Australia before being looped into GILL's orbit at the Cape and becoming a protege of the Cape astronomer. And yet, Innes would develop a very strong attachment to Southern Africa. He called himself an Afrikander, D-E-R ending, which is a peculiar sort of British term for what was hoped to be an emerging national identity in South Africa. But apart from that, Innes had a vision of South Africa's sovereign place in international astronomy. It is he who lobbied through the Ministry of Interior for South Africa's membership in the new organization, the International Astronomical Union, in 1919 and 1920. Innes really had to battle the incomprehension of local bureaucrats why this could be meaningful. And although South Africa wasn't able to join in the first General Assembly of the IAU, by 1925, it was fully dues-paying a member, and it would send its own delegate to Cambridge, to the GA there. One of Innes's personal and scientific friends, Alex Roberts. Innes is best known as an observer for his monitoring of double stars, visual double stars, and as a self-taught applied mathematician. But by the 1920s, he was fully alive to the new astronomy, astrophysics, the need for new instrumentation and new personnel at the Union Observatory in Johannesburg. And examining his correspondence is now preserved in the CSIR library in Pretoria. It's clear that he struggled with his government masters for funding, for acknowledgement, for advancement, and much of that was frustrated. He made repeated requests, for instance, for a 1 meter class reflecting telescope for astrophysical research, but this was just as repeatedly denied. So where did he turn for capacity building? Cooperative agreements abroad. And his great success was through Leiden University in the Netherlands. He was invited to receive an honorary doctorate at Leiden in 1923. And he took that opportunity to negotiate an agreement to allow Dutch-based astronomers to use the facilities in Johannesburg and have access to the clear skies in the southern hemisphere that he was able to offer them. And this is a salient feature of this period, not so much South African involvement, but international overseas interest in astronomy in the region. Leiden, in a way, led, certainly for Europe. Americans would be rather bothersome, and Harvard, Yale, University of Michigan, through their heads of the department, Harlow Shapley at Harvard, very interested in galactic astronomy and the Magellanic Clouds. Frank Schlesinger at Yale, who was a pioneer in photographic measurement of stellar parallaxes. And then sort of tailing behind, William Hussey was more of a traditionalist visual astronomer interested in double stars. But all three of these major American universities in the 1920s become involved in South African astronomy and situate observing stations in the country. All three had something of a relationship with Innes at the Union Observatory. I do have to say that given their own resources, even Harvard and Yale, American philanthropy was required to really build up a foundation. And the foundation that that would be immediately involved was the Rockefeller Foundation, that funded both Leiden's photographic refractor in 1930 and Harvard's 60-inch reflecting telescope later in the 1930s. So American money was really a key feature. But we can say 20th century philanthropy was an important player. From the British perspective, it wasn't so much 20th century as 18th century philanthropy through the Radcliffe Trust that was based in Oxford. According to the founding documents of this trust, its interests would have to remain in the UK. In the late 1920s and early 30s, there was protracted, legal battle to remove the astronomical interests of the trust from Oxford in its polluted and cloudy skies to clear southern hemisphere skies near Pretoria. And that's finally concluded in 1937 with the arrival of Knox Shaw, who begins to build the Radcliffe Observatory in South Africa. Of course, it would only be ready to pursue research after the Second World War. But 1937 was the foundational year. Any discussion of astronomy in South Africa in this period really has to look clearly and honestly at what was a fact in the country throughout the 20th century. And that is a system of racial segregation and oppression that's often politely ignored in histories of science. In my comments this afternoon, I just want to recognize perhaps the most liberal politically liberal astronomer in the country in the 20s and 30s, Alex Roberts, that friend of Innes, who was a noteworthy variable star astronomer and a mission educator who was based at Lovedale in Eastern Cape. He had a wonderful opportunity to engage his African students in modern physical science. He had an important facility right at hand. He was conducting pretty cutting edge research, at least in the early 1920s. And some of his pupils at Lovedale were gaining top scores in their matric exams in math and physical science. And yet even someone like Roberts couldn't conceive of an African student pursuing any sort of career, any sort of research in science, let alone astronomy. That doesn't mean that the majority population of South Africa was disinterested or entirely ignorant of astronomy. As been observed many times in the symposium, the sky is the common heritage of all mankind, and Africans had centuries, possibly millennia, of experience using the night and daytime sky as important cultural resources. And yet, an engagement with modern astronomy and astrophysics is almost completely denied them in this period. There are little signs of light shining through, and one is the first astronomy book written in a Southern African language, Sesotho. The English title would roughly be The Sky and the World. It first appeared in a mission newspaper in the first decade of the 20th century. The reputed author was Samuel Duby, who was a French missionary who compiled popular astronomy bits and translated them. The audience, the readership, was entirely African, literate in the Sesotho language. And it was a large enough audience that these newspaper articles were amalgamated into a first edition in 1908 and a second printing 2 years later. So there were enough people who were really curious about the new astronomy, 20th century astronomy. There are other signs, particularly through the journalism and the literary production of Sol Plaatje, who very numerously mentions comets, such as Halley's Comet, eclipses, lunar solar eclipses, meteor showers, and other phenomena, in indigenous languages for his African readership. And yet, as far as the established astronomers in the country are concerned, there could be no participation by the majority population in this period. So some takeaways in this brief presentation. Astronomy in the GILL legacy period remained largely extractive. Overseas players, whether they were British, European, or American, were interested in acquiring data mainly through thousands and thousands of photographic plates, shipping them back home for measurement and analysis in publication. There was very little South African ownership in the research that was being produced. And a very large majority of South Africans were excluded entirely from this enterprise. I've tried to be careful in using the phrase astronomy in South Africa to describe this period. South African astronomy, something with national institutions that has South African participation, South African players, South African membership in the wider global community. Well, that's something that lay in the future, and really after the end of the segregation period and the apartheid period in the 1990s. Finally, I want to acknowledge those who have got me into this mess. Utah's far away from Southern Africa. And in 1994, it was Professor Brian Warner who took me out of 14th century studies and said 19th and 20th century astronomy, Southern Africa was rather interesting. I have to name the late Dara O'Donoghue, who is a personal inspiration of mine, on the late Tony Farrell, particularly in his planetarium work at the Iziko Museum in Cape Town, Professor Tebe Madupe at University of Northwest, who personifies this new golden age, and I count as a friend. And finally, Davi van Jaarsveld in Bloemfontein, where he's the curator of the Astronomical Museum at the Boyden Observatory, where the Alex Roberts papers are preserved. And lastly, thank you everyone who's participating in this live stream and who may listen and watch this recording, and who has participated in this symposium. Both scientifically and historically, this is a very important conference and commemoration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Keith, for that more personable history of astronomy in South Africa. Daniel, do we have any questions on Slido?
Yeah, there's just one from David Buckley. David asks, Innes was somewhat of a libertine in his day, much to the consternation of some of his colleagues. Was his friend Roberts of a similar mind?
Not at all, although they both probably enjoyed a dram or two when they could get some scotch. Roberts was more of a traditionalist. He was a member of the Free Church of Scotland, but not a teetotaler. They have a very friendly correspondence with one another. And they were cooperative scientifically, but no, they were very different personally.
I have one question. I was intrigued to see the list of high-profile collaborations and interests with different partners overseas. In your opinion, which of those would you say, one or more had the greatest effect in shaping the kind of astronomy we do in South Africa today? And what kind of partnerships should we be looking at making going forward to change the face of astronomy going forward?
Oh, goodness. It would certainly have to be Harvard and Harlow Shapley, who was an internationalist. Many of his graduate students at Harvard were not American. In fact, they weren't European. He had Indian, Chinese, other global students, and he did his best to promote their careers, not just in the United States, but when they went back to their home countries. And his style of science, which was collaborative and astrophysical. He was really embedded in the new astronomy. Others, Yale was sort of intermediate. The University of Michigan, I'm a Michigander myself, an alumnus from Ann Arbor, was really stuck in a 19th century mode and would be less influential. So Harvard is the first rank, and it would remain presence. In fact, the governing entity at Boyden to the mid-1950s and continue to cooperate through the Boyden Council to the late 1970s. So there's a sense of astronomy as an international science that goes beyond these national boundaries and identities. Although I'm sure that Shapley himself would acknowledge that national institutions, and in fact, local institutions, were vitally important. He thought just as galactic astronomy was expanding our vision of the universe in terms of time and space, we should think on the human scale of being much more inclusive, at least everyone on Earth.
Thank you, Keith. Thanks once again for your contribution. I'm afraid that's all we have time for.